The morning sun filtered through the blinds of a quiet hotel room just outside the city. Inside, a man in his late 50s stood in front of the mirror, studying his reflection with a mix of curiosity and unease. He'd shaved off the neat beard he'd worn for over a decade, swapped his tailored shirts for a faded flannel and jeans from a thrift store, and tucked his expensive watch into a drawer. To anyone passing by, he looked like just another guy trying to stretch his dollar. Maybe a retired mechanic, maybe a handyman between jobs. No one would guess he owned one of the largest buffet chains in the country. He hadn't planned this trip lightly. For months, something had been gnawing at him. The quarterly reports all looked good. Sales up, customer traffic steady, online reviews mostly positive. But the numbers felt hollow. His manager spoke in polished phrases during meetings. Operational efficiency, guest experience optimization, throughput maximization. He'd nod along, but deep down, he missed the days when running a restaurant meant knowing your customers by name, tasting the soup before it hit the steam table, and checking in on the dishwasher who'd worked the night shift for 20 years. Back then, his first diner had been small, just 12 tables, a counter, and a kitchen that smelled like garlic and burnt coffee all day long. He'd opened it with his father's savings and a stubborn belief that good food and kindness could build something real. Now, with over 60 locations, he rarely set foot in any of them. Everything was filtered through layers of management, spreadsheets, and focus groups. He needed to see it for himself, not as the boss, but as someone who just wanted a hot meal. He grabbed a worn baseball cap, pulled it low, and slipped out the door. The buffet he chose wasn't the flagship downtown location with chandeliers and live piano music. It was a suburban spot near a bus terminal, busy, no frills, the kind of place where people came because it was affordable, not because it was fancy. He'd picked it precisely for that reason. If his company still stood for what he believed in, it would show here where margins were thin and customers didn't have much room for disappointment. The lunch crowd was already building when he arrived. Families with tired kids, older couples sharing a booth, a few solo diners with newspapers or phones. He took a tray and joined the line, watching how the staff moved. The salad bar was well stocked, but the tongs for the pasta were sticky. The hot food section steamed under heat lamps, but the labels were smudged, and one bin held what looked like yesterday's mashed potatoes. Still, the smell was familiar. Roast chicken, garlic bread, that slightly sweet gravy his grandmother used to make. For a second, he felt like he was back in his first kitchen. He filled his plate modestly, some greens, a piece of chicken, a spoonful of rice, and found a seat near the back, where he could observe without being noticed. That's when he saw the man. He was thin, maybe in his late 70s, wearing a threadbare coat even though it was warm inside. His hands trembled slightly as he carried his tray, but he moved with quiet dignity. He sat alone at a small table by the window, arranging his food carefully as if each bite mattered. After finishing his plate, he hesitated, then walked slowly back to the hot food station. The line had thinned, and he stood there for a moment before politely asking the server behind the counter for a little more soup. The server, a young woman with a name tag that read Tina, barely looked up from her phone. "You already had a plate," she said, voice flat. "We don't do seconds unless you pay for another round." The old man blinked. I didn't take much the first time. And the soup's almost gone anyway." Tina sighed, glanced at the nearly empty pot, then rolled her eyes. "Fine, but next time, fill up the first go. Some of you act like this is a soup kitchen." She ladled a small portion into a bowl and shoved it toward him. As he turned away, she muttered, just loud enough for nearby tables to hear. "Like he's gonna tip anyway. Probably eats here every day just to stretch his Social Security." A few people nearby shifted uncomfortably. No one said anything. The man in the flannel shirt, still unrecognized, still silent, froze with his fork halfway to his mouth. His chest tightened. It wasn't just the words. It was the casual cruelty. The assumption that someone's hunger was a burden. He remembered his own grandfather, who'd lost everything in the recession and once walked 3 miles to get a free meal at a church basement. No one had mocked him there. They'd given him seconds without asking. He watched as the older man returned to his table, head slightly lowered, but still eating slowly, deliberately, as if refusing to let shame steal his dignity. Something inside the CEO cracked open, not with anger but with grief. This wasn't just about one rude employee. It was about a culture that had drifted far from the values he thought he'd built into the company. He finished his meal without tasting it. Back in his hotel room that evening, he couldn't sleep. He pulled out his laptop and logged into the internal HR system, something he rarely did. He typed in the location number and scrolled through recent staff records. Tina had been there 8 months. Her sales numbers were high. She pushed desserts and drinks aggressively, which managers loved. But buried in the notes were 2 customer complaints, one about her tone, another about her refusing refills to an elderly couple. Both had been marked resolved with a generic apology email. No coaching, no follow-up. He dug deeper. The store manager, a man named Carl, had been promoted from another location 6 months ago. His performance reviews praised his cost control and labor efficiency. But in the comments section, one district supervisor had written, "Watch for overemphasis on speed. Some staff seem stressed." That note had been ignored. He leaned back in the chair, rubbing his temples. It was easy to blame Tina, but she was a product of the system he'd allowed to grow. When bonuses were tied to upsells and speed, when kindness wasn't measured or rewarded, what did he expect? He'd built a machine that ran on metrics, not meaning. The next morning, he returned to the buffet, not to confront anyone, but to understand more. He sat in the same spot, ordered coffee this time, and watched. He saw Tina snap at a young mother whose toddler spilled juice. He saw a busser hurriedly wipe down a table while a customer was still eating, as if rushing them out. But he also saw small acts of grace, a cook quietly replacing a dropped roll for a little girl, a cashier helping an older woman count her change without making her feel slow. And then he saw the old man again. He came in around the same time, wearing the same coat. This time he didn't go straight to the food line. He stood near the drink station looking tired. The CEO watched as a different server, a man with kind eyes and a name tag that read Luis, noticed him. Without being asked, Luis filled a glass of water, added a lemon slice, and brought it to the man's table. A few minutes later, he slipped a fresh dinner roll onto the man's tray when no one else was looking. The CEO felt a lump in his throat. After the man left, the CEO lingered. When Luis passed by, he asked casually, "That gentleman, does he come here often?" Luis glanced toward the door, then lowered his voice. "Yeah, every Tuesday and Friday. Always just soup and bread. Says it's the only place he can afford that feels normal." He paused. "His wife passed last year. Lives alone now. I think he just likes hearing people talk." The CEO nodded, throat tight. "You're a good man," Luis shrugged. "Just doing my job." But the CEO knew better. That wasn't just doing a job. That was being human. That night, he made a decision. He wouldn't fire Tina on the spot. He wouldn't storm in as the CEO and demand apologies. That might fix the symptom, but not the disease. Instead, he needed to remind everyone, including himself, why they were really here. Not to move trays fast or hit sales targets, but to feed people, all people, with respect. He called his assistant the next morning. "Cancel my meetings for the week," he said. "I'm staying put." Over the next few days, he kept visiting, always in disguise, always listening. He saw how the staff interacted when they thought no one important was watching. He heard jokes that crossed the line, shortcuts that compromised food safety, and moments of quiet compassion that went unnoticed by management. He took notes, not in a corporate binder, but in a small notebook he'd bought at a gas station, the kind his father used to carry. By the end of the week, he knew what he had to do. He couldn't fix everything overnight, but he could start with this one location. He could show his team that how they treated people mattered more than how quickly they turned tables. And he could honor the man in the threadbare coat, not by making a spectacle of him, but by ensuring no one ever felt unwelcome in a place that bore his name. He packed his things, checked out of the hotel, and drove back to headquarters. But he didn't go straight to his office. First, he stopped by the kitchen of his original diner, the one still open, now run by a longtime friend. He tied on an apron, rolled up his sleeves, and spent the afternoon making soup from scratch, just like his father taught him. As the broth simmered, filling the room with warmth and the scent of thyme and onion, he finally felt like he was coming back to himself. The real work was about to begin. And it wouldn't be about profits. It would be about people. The second time the CEO returned to the buffet, he didn't wear the flannel shirt or the baseball cap. He dressed even more plainly. A plain gray sweatshirt, worn sneakers, and glasses he'd picked up at a drugstore. He wanted to disappear completely into the background, to move through the space like air. This time his goal wasn't just to observe. He wanted to understand the man who'd been mocked, the quiet figure in the threadbare coat whose dignity had been chipped away with a careless comment. He arrived just before lunch, taking a seat near the same window table the older man had used. He ordered coffee and waited. The buffet hummed with its usual rhythm, trays clinking, children laughing, the low murmur of conversation. Staff moved with practiced speed, though their faces carried a kind of tiredness that went deeper than a long shift. It was the look of people who felt watched but not seen. Right on schedule, the man walked in. He moved slower this time, leaning slightly on a cane he hadn't used before. His coat was buttoned all the way up even though the dining room was warm. He scanned the room briefly, then headed straight for the soup station. The CEO watched as he filled a small bowl, just enough for one serving, and added a single slice of bread from the basket. No extras, no requests. He carried his tray carefully as if every movement cost him something. The CEO waited a few minutes, then got up and walked over with his own coffee. "Mind if I join you?" he asked gently. All the other tables seemed full. The man looked up, surprised, then nodded. "Of course. Plenty of room." They sat in silence for a moment. The CEO sipped his coffee, giving the man space. He didn't want to pry. He just wanted to be near someone who reminded him of his own grandfather, quiet, proud, and carrying a weight no one else could see. After a while, the man spoke. "You come here often?" "First time, actually," the CEO said truthfully. "Heard the soup was good." The man smiled faintly. "It is, especially the chicken noodle. Reminds me of my wife's." There was a pause, soft and heavy. The CEO didn't rush to fill it. He just let the quiet sit between them like a shared breath. Eventually, the man added, "She passed last spring. After 53 years together, the house got too quiet. Too big." He stirred his soup slowly. "I started coming here because, well, at home, eating alone feels like giving up. But here, I'm just one of many. No one asks questions. No one pities me." The CEO felt a sharp ache in his chest. "That's a good reason." "It's not charity," the man said quickly, as if he'd heard that word too many times before. "I pay my way. Always have. Just sometimes the money doesn't stretch like it used to." He explained that he'd been a high school history teacher for over 30 years, retired now, living on a pension and Social Security. His wife's medical bills had drained most of their savings. He didn't say it with bitterness, just fact, like stating the weather. "I don't need much," he said. "A warm meal. A place to sit for an hour, maybe overhear a conversation about baseball or the news. It keeps me feeling part of the world." The CEO listened, really listened, not as a businessman analyzing customer behavior, but as a human being hearing another human being's truth. He thought about how easy it was to reduce people to data points, low spenders, slow movers, frequent diners. But this man wasn't a category. He was a life, a story, a person who'd shaped young minds, loved deeply, and now faced loneliness with quiet courage. They talked a little more about books, about how the city had changed, about the strange comfort of routine. Before leaving, the man thanked him for the company. "Most folks don't sit with strangers anymore," he said. "It's nice." After he left, the CEO stayed at the table longer than he needed to. He watched the staff again, but now his eyes were sharper. He noticed how the manager, a man with a clipboard and a tight expression, hovered near the entrance, counting how long customers stayed. He saw a new employee being scolded for refilling a water glass without being asked. "We're not a hotel," the manager snapped. "Focus on turnover, turnover." The word felt cold, like people were just plates to be cleared and reset. Later that afternoon, back in his hotel room, the CEO dug into the company's internal files again. He pulled up the store's customer feedback logs. Not the polished summaries sent to executives, but the raw comments submitted through the website and comment cards, buried among the usual great food and friendly staff, were quieter, sadder notes. Felt rushed even though I wasn't in a hurry. Server made me feel bad for asking for more bread. Used to come here with my husband. Now I don't feel welcome alone. These weren't outliers. They were patterns. And no one had connected the dots. He also reviewed the store's staffing schedule. The lunch rush was covered by only 3 servers, though the location regularly served over 200 guests in 2 hours. The kitchen crew was short one person. Someone had quit 2 weeks ago and the position hadn't been filled. No wonder everyone seemed stressed. They weren't being rude out of meanness. They were drowning in pressure to do more with less, and the company's own policies were pushing them to treat customers like obstacles to efficiency. But then there was Luis, the dishwasher who'd given the old man extra bread. The CEO pulled his file. Luis had worked at the location for 4 years, always on the night shift, always with perfect attendance. No complaints. In fact, there were several unsolicited notes from coworkers praising his reliability and kindness. Yet he'd never been considered for a promotion. Why? Because he didn't speak perfect English, and because his role wasn't customer-facing in the official sense. The CEO stared at the screen. Here was a man living the company's supposed values: compassion, service, humility, while those invisible roles were rewarded for pushing drinks and cutting corners. That evening, he drove to a nearby park and sat on a bench watching the sunset. He thought about the retired teacher, sitting alone in a sea of people just trying to feel human. He thought about Luis working in the back, unnoticed but essential. And he thought about himself, how far he'd drifted from the kitchen, from the people, from the heart of what he'd built. He remembered opening his first diner with his father. They'd had a rule: if someone came in looking hungry, you fed them. No questions. No judgment. Food isn't just fuel, his father used to say. It's respect. When had they forgotten that? The next day he returned to the buffet one more time, not as a spy but as someone trying to remember how to see. He watched Luis during the lunch rush. Even while scrubbing pots, he kept an eye on the dining room. When a child dropped her ice cream, Luis was the one who brought a new cup before the parents even asked. When the elderly man came in, Luis made sure his water was full and his bread basket never empty. No one told him to do that. He just did it because it was right. Meanwhile, Tina, the server who'd made the cruel remark, was back at her station. She smiled brightly at a group of businessmen, upselling them on dessert and coffee refills. Her energy was sharp, efficient. But when a young mother with a stroller asked for a high chair, Tina sighed and said, "We only have 2 and they're both in use. Maybe try the booth?" Her tone wasn't outright rude, but it carried an edge of impatience, as if the woman's need was an inconvenience. The CEO saw the mother's shoulders slump as she shuffled away. He realized then that the problem wasn't just one employee. It was a system that rewarded performance that looked good on paper but felt cold in person. Speed over kindness, sales over service, efficiency over empathy. That night he called his head of operations. "I need you to pull all customer feedback from the past year, every single comment, good or bad. And I want a report on staffing levels across all locations. Compare them to actual foot traffic, not projections." There was a pause on the line. "Is everything okay?" "I'm not sure yet," he said. "But I think we've been measuring the wrong things." He hung up and opened a blank document on his laptop. At the top he typed, "What we've forgotten." He wrote about the man in the coat, about Luis, about the mother with the stroller. He wrote about how food should never come with shame, how a business isn't just a place to make money, but a place where people meet, rest, and sometimes just survive another day. He didn't have all the answers yet, but he knew this. If his company couldn't treat its most vulnerable guests with basic decency, then all the profits in the world wouldn't mean a thing. Before bed, he reread the note he'd written. Then he added one more line at the bottom: "We don't serve customers. We serve people." The next morning, he checked out of the hotel. But he didn't go home. He drove to the company's training center, where new managers learned the buffet way. He sat in the back of a session unnoticed, listening as instructors drilled trainees on upsell scripts and table turn times. Nowhere in the manual was there a section on compassion. Nowhere did it say, "If someone looks tired, offer them a moment. If someone seems hungry, give them seconds." He left before the session ended. But he knew what he had to do next. He would return, not in disguise, but as himself. And he would ask his team one simple question: who are we really here for? The answer would shape everything that came after. The third time he walked into the buffet, he didn't try to hide. He wore his usual clothes: dark slacks, a crisp button-down, the kind of outfit that didn't scream executive, but carried a quiet authority. He didn't announce himself at the door. He just walked in like any other guest, took a tray, and joined the lunch line. But this time his eyes weren't scanning for flaws or failures. They were searching for truth, about his company, his people, and the quiet choices made when no one's watching. It was a Tuesday, the same day the retired teacher usually came. The CEO hoped he'd see him again, not to intrude, but to silently honor the courage it took to show up in a world that often forgets the quiet ones. But the man wasn't there. The table by the window sat empty. Still, the CEO felt his presence like a quiet hum in the room. He filled his plate with care. Roast beef, green beans, a spoonful of mashed potatoes, and found a seat near the center of the dining area, where he could see everything without being obvious. The lunch rush was in full swing. Families, office workers, a few seniors eating alone. The noise was comforting in its normalcy. Clinking silverware, laughter, the occasional cry of a tired toddler. This was real life, and he was finally part of it again. What struck him first wasn't the food or the service, it was the contrast. On one side of the room, a group of well-dressed men in suits were being fawned over by Tina. She laughed at their jokes, refilled their drinks before they asked, and even brought out a special dessert, just for regulars like you. Her energy was bright, polished, the kind that looked perfect in a performance review. But just a few tables away, a woman in worn clothes sat with two young children. She looked exhausted. One of the kids had spilled milk on the floor, and she was frantically wiping it with napkins, whispering apologies to no one in particular. Tina walked right past her, not once offering a mop or even a kind word. When the woman finally raised her hand to ask for more water, Tina gave a tight smile and said, "Be right there," but never returned. The CEO watched the woman's shoulders sink. She gathered her kids quickly, paid in exact change, and left without finishing her meal. His stomach twisted. He turned his attention to the kitchen entrance. Luis was there carrying a bus tub of dirty dishes. As he passed the empty booth where the woman had sat, he paused. Without hesitation, he set down his tub, grabbed a clean rag from his apron, and wiped the spilled milk off the floor. Then he refilled the water pitcher at the station and left it on the table for the next guest. No one told him to. No one saw him do it. He just did what needed doing. That small act stayed with the CEO longer than any sales report ever had. Later, during a lull in the rush, he wandered toward the drink station under the pretense of getting more coffee. Luis was restocking cups. The CEO nodded. "You've got a good eye for what people need." Luis looked up, surprised. "Just part of the job, is it?" the CEO asked gently. "Or is it just who you are?" Luis didn't answer right away. He glanced toward the dining room where Tina was now showing a group of customers the premium dessert menu. "Some folks think serving means pushing extras," he said quietly. "I think it means seeing people." The CEO felt those words settle deep in his chest. "You're right. He didn't reveal who he was, not yet. But he stayed close, watching how Luis moved through his shift. He saw him help a new busser figure out where the clean silverware went. He saw him quietly replace a broken chair without being asked. And when an elderly woman struggled to carry her tray, Luis appeared beside her like he'd been waiting, took it gently, and walked her to her table. No fanfare. No expectation of thanks, just steady, quiet care. Meanwhile, the manager, Carl, spent most of his time near the register, reviewing the day's sales on a tablet. He barked orders about speeding up table turnover and reminded servers to push the combo deals. At one point, he pulled Tina aside and praised her for killing it on beverage sales. The CEO overheard him say, "Keep this up and you'll be up for assistant manager next quarter." There was no mention of kindness, no note about how guests felt, just numbers. That afternoon, the CEO sat in his car in the parking lot, engine off, thinking. He'd come looking for a villain, the rude server, the indifferent manager, and instead found something more complicated. Tina wasn't evil. She was doing what she'd been trained to do: perform, sell, move fast. Carl wasn't heartless. He was under pressure from above to cut costs and boost profits. They weren't bad people. They were products of a system that had lost its soul, and he was the one who'd built that system. He remembered a meeting from years ago, early in the chain's expansion. His CFO had argued for stricter portion controls to reduce food costs. "We can't give unlimited seconds if it eats into margins," he'd said. The CEO had agreed reluctantly, but added, "As long as we never make a guest feel ashamed for being hungry." Somewhere along the way, That promise had been forgotten. Back at the hotel, he called his head of human resources. I want to review every employee at this location, not just their performance metrics, but their peer feedback, their longevity, the little things they do that don't show up on a spreadsheet. Like what? She asked. Like who stays late to help a coworker, who notices when a guest is struggling, who treats the dishwasher with the same respect as the district manager. There was a long pause. We don't track that. I know, he said. That's the problem. The next morning, he returned to the buffet one last time before making his move. This time, he sat near the kitchen door, where staff passed back and forth. He watched how they treated each other when they thought no customer was watching. He saw Tina snap at a busser for moving too slow. He saw Carl ignore a cook who asked for a break after 4 hours straight on the line. But he also saw Luis share his lunch with a new employee who'd forgotten theirs. He saw a cashier quietly cover a shift for a coworker whose child was sick. The good and the bad existed side by side. And the difference wasn't in the people, it was in what the company chose to reward. That afternoon, he drove to the local library. He found a quiet corner and pulled out his notebook. He wrote down everything he'd seen: the spilled milk, the extra roll, the ignored water request, the quiet dignity of the man who came for soup. Then he asked himself the hardest question. What would my father do? The answer came quickly. He wouldn't fire Tina and call it justice. He'd ask why she felt the need to be so hard. He wouldn't promote Luis just to make a point. He'd create a place where people like Luis were seen as the backbone of the business, not the background. He closed the notebook and walked outside. The sun was low, casting long shadows on the sidewalk. He thought about the retired teacher, probably at home right now, eating a simple dinner alone. He thought about Luis still scrubbing pots in a hot kitchen. And he thought about himself, standing at a crossroads between the company he'd built and the man he wanted to be. He knew what he had to do. The next day, he didn't go to the buffet in disguise. He didn't send an email or schedule a Zoom call. He walked in during the pre-lunch lull, dressed in the same clothes he'd worn the day before, and asked to speak with the manager. Carl came out from the back, wiping his hands on a towel. He looked the man up and down, unsure. Can I help you? The CEO extended his hand. I think you can. My name is Robert. I own this company. Carl froze. His face went pale. I am, the CEO said calmly. And I've been here for the past week watching. He didn't say it with anger. He said it with sorrow. Carl stammered. I didn't know. We would have prepared a show? The CEO finished gently. That's exactly the problem. He asked Carl to gather the entire team, servers, cooks, dishwashers, cashiers, in the dining room after closing that night. Everyone, he said. Even the part-timers. Carl nodded, still shaken. That evening, as the last guest left and the lights dimmed, the staff gathered around the empty tables. Some looked nervous, others curious. Luis stood near the back, arms crossed, expression unreadable. The CEO didn't stand on a chair or raise his voice. He just spoke plainly and honestly. I came here because I forgot what this place is really about, he began. I got lost in numbers and reports and forgot to look people in the eye. But this week I saw things that reminded me. He told them about the man who came for soup, not to shame him but to honor his quiet strength. He talked about the spilled milk and the woman who left feeling unwelcome. He mentioned the extra roll, the refilled water glass, the chair fixed without being asked. I saw both the best and the worst of us, he said, and I realized we've built a system that rewards the wrong things. We've made it hard to be kind and easy to be efficient. That's my fault, not yours. He looked at Tina. You're good at your job. But being good shouldn't mean making someone feel small. Then he turned to Luis. And you've been doing the real work all along. The work that doesn't show up on a sales report but keeps this place human. No one spoke. The room was thick with emotion. I'm not here to fire anyone, he continued. I'm here to fix what's broken. Starting tomorrow, we're changing how we measure success. Not just by how much we sell, but by how people feel when they leave here. He announced a new policy. Unlimited seconds for anyone who asks no questions. A dignity guarantee. No guest would ever be rushed, mocked, or made to feel like a burden. And he revealed that Luis would be trained as a shift lead, not as a reward, but because leadership should reflect character, not just charisma. Then he did something unexpected. He took off his jacket, rolled up his sleeves, and said, "Tonight I'm washing dishes with Luis, because it's time I remembered what this work really feels like." As the staff slowly returned to their stations, some with tears in their eyes, the CEO stood by the sink, apron tied, scrubbing plates beside the man who'd shown him the way back. And for the first time in years, he felt like he belonged. The morning after the meeting, the buffet felt different, not because anything had physically changed, but because the air itself seemed lighter. Staff moved with a new kind of attention, not just to tasks but to each other. Tina arrived early, not with her usual brisk confidence but with quiet uncertainty. She avoided eye contact at first, tying her apron slowly as if unsure where she fit now. Luis, on the other hand, stood a little taller. He wasn't wearing a new uniform or a fancy title yet, but people nodded to him differently, like they finally saw him. The CEO didn't show up in a suit this time. He came in jeans and a plain t-shirt carrying a thermos of coffee. He didn't announce his presence. He just walked straight to the kitchen, tied on an apron, and asked the head cook what needed doing. For the next few hours, he chopped vegetables, refilled steam trays, and swept floors. No one treated him like the boss. They treated him like someone who was finally willing to stand where the real work happened. By lunchtime, the dining room began to fill. Among the first to arrive was the retired teacher. He looked surprised to see so many staff members moving with unusual care. Water glasses filled before they were empty, chairs adjusted without being asked, a warm, "Good to see you" from the hostess. When he reached the soup station, Tina was there. She looked at him, then quickly looked down. "Chicken noodles fresh today," she said softly. "Would you like a bowl?" He nodded, a little wary. She ladled a generous portion, then added, "And there's extra bread if you'd like." "On the house," he paused. "That's very kind." She didn't smile, but her voice softened. "I'm sorry about last time." He studied her for a moment, then simply said, "We all have days." He took his tray and sat at his usual table. A few minutes later, Luis brought over a small dish of buttered carrots. "Compliments of the kitchen," he said with a quiet nod. The man smiled. "Tell them thank you." Across the room, the CEO watched from behind the salad bar, pretending to restock croutons. He felt something loosen in his chest. This wasn't about grand gestures or public apologies. It was about small, honest moments, people choosing to be better, not because they were forced to, but because they remembered they could. Later that afternoon, after the lunch rush faded, the CEO gathered the management team in the back office, not for a lecture, but for a conversation. He sat on a folding chair, not behind a desk. Carl, the store manager, stood near the door, arms crossed, still tense. "I'm not here to punish you," the CEO said. "I'm here to understand. Tell me, what's it really like running this place?" Carl hesitated, then sighed. "It's hard. Corporate keeps cutting labor hours, but customer traffic hasn't dropped. We're always short-staffed, and the bonuses, they're tied to upsells and speed. If I don't push my team on drinks and desserts, my numbers look bad. My job's on the line," the CEO nodded. "I didn't realize how much pressure you were under." "I didn't make that server act that way," Carl added, glancing toward the dining room. "But I didn't stop it either. I figured, as long as sales were up, it wasn't my problem." "That's on me," the CEO said. "I built a system that made you think kindness was optional." He pulled out a folder. Inside were revised performance guidelines. No more bonuses based solely on sales. Instead, teams would be evaluated on guest feedback about respect, patience, and care. Staff would get credit for helping co-workers, for noticing when someone needed extra time, for treating every guest like a person, not a transaction. "We're also hiring 2 more part-timers for this location," he said. "Effective immediately. You won't be stretched so thin." Carl's shoulders dropped just slightly. "You're serious?" "I'm done measuring success by how fast we empty tables," the CEO said. "From now on, we measure it by how full people feel, not just their stomachs, but their hearts." Over the next few days, changes rolled out quietly. Signs went up near the food stations. Seconds, of course. Just ask. Staff were given short training sessions, not on sales scripts, but on active listening, on reading body language, on how to offer help without making someone feel pitied. Tina sat through them with her arms crossed at first, but by the 3rd session, she was taking notes. One afternoon, the CEO watched her interact with a young couple struggling to manage a fussy baby. Instead of rushing them, she brought over a high chair they hadn't known was available, offered a clean bib from the back, and even warmed a bottle in the kitchen. When the mother thanked her, Tina just said, "We've all been there, it wasn't perfect. Old habits didn't vanish overnight." But the shift was real. Meanwhile, Luis began shadowing Carl during opening shifts. He wasn't being handed a title. He was earning it, learning inventory, scheduling, how to handle a rush without losing his calm. The staff respected him not because management said to, but because they'd always known he was the steady hand in the storm. One evening, as the CEO helped wipe down tables after closing, Luis approached him. "Why now?" he asked. "Why come here, do all this, after all these years?" The CEO leaned on the mop handle. "Because I almost lost what mattered most. I built a business, but I forgot it was supposed to be about people. Not profits, not performance charts, people." Luis nodded slowly. "My father used to say, 'A man is known by how he treats those who can do nothing for him.' I think you remembered that." The words hung in the air, simple and true. The next week, the CEO called a company-wide virtual meeting. He didn't start with financials or growth targets. He told a story about a man who came for soup, about a server who spoke without thinking, about a dishwasher who gave bread without being asked. He didn't name anyone. He just said, "This happened at one of our locations, and it could happen at any of them if we're not careful." Then he announced the empty seat program. Every buffet would reserve one table, just one, that would always be open to someone in need. No questions asked, no payment required. If someone walked in looking hungry, tired, or alone, they could sit there and the staff would treat them like any other guest. Full meal, warm drink, dignity included. He also shared the new evaluation system, emphasizing that leadership roles would now consider character as much as competence. "We don't need more salespeople," he said. "We need more humans." The response was overwhelming. Within hours, messages poured in from managers across the country, some skeptical, many relieved. One wrote, "I've wanted to do this for years, but I thought leadership wouldn't care." Another said, "My team cried when I told them. They've been waiting for permission to be kind." But not everyone was on board. A regional director pushed back hard. "This isn't charity," he argued in a private call. "We're a business, not a shelter." The CEO listened, then said, "We're a business that feeds people, and if we can't feed their dignity along with their hunger, then we've failed at both." He stood firm. The program rolled out. Back at the original location, things kept changing in small, meaningful ways. A regular customer started leaving extra tips, not for better service, but for the kindness. A local church reached out, asking if they could refer elderly members who lived alone. The staff began recognizing faces, not just for how much they spent, but for their stories. The man who liked extra pickles, the woman who always ordered tea with honey, the teenager who came after school to study while eating a small meal. One Friday, the retired teacher arrived looking brighter than usual. He sat at his table, and this time he didn't eat alone. Luis brought over a second chair and sat with him for 10 minutes during his break, talking about books and old movies. No one rushed them. No one minded. The CEO watched from the kitchen window, a quiet smile on his face. That night, as he packed his bag to return home, he stopped by the dining room one last time. The lights were low, the chairs stacked, the floors freshly mopped. He walked to the table by the window, the one that would now be part of the empty seat program, and ran his hand over the smooth wood. He thought about all the meals that would be shared there in the weeks and months to come, not just food, but moments of connection, of quiet grace, of people remembering they weren't invisible. He didn't fix everything in a week. Systems don't change overnight, but he'd planted a seed, and sometimes that's enough. As he stepped out into the cool evening air, he felt something he hadn't in years. Peace. Not because the business was perfect, but because it was finally becoming what it was meant to be. A place where everyone, no matter their story, could sit down and feel seen. And that, he knew, was worth more than any profit margin. Weeks had passed since the CEO first walked into the buffet in disguise, and the place felt like a different world. Not because the walls had changed or the menu had been rewritten, but because something deeper had shifted. It was in the way people greeted each other, in the extra moment a server took to ask how someone's day was going, in the quiet understanding that everyone who walked through those doors carried a story worth respecting. The empty seat program had started small. Just one table, unmarked near the window. But word spread, not through ads or press releases, but through whispers at bus stops, conversations at senior centers, nods between neighbors. People began to notice that if you walked in looking tired or unsure, someone would gently guide you to that table. No questions, no judgment, just a warm meal and the unspoken message: you belong here. The retired teacher came more often now, not just for the food, but because he'd started to feel like part of something again. He'd even brought a book one afternoon and left it on the community shelf near the drink station with a note: for whoever needs a good story. The next day, someone had returned it with a bookmark and a thank you scribbled on a napkin. Luis, now officially a shift lead, moved through the dining room with calm authority. He didn't wear his new role like a badge. He wore it like a responsibility. He made sure new hires understood that kindness wasn't optional. It was the foundation. When a teenage busser spilled an entire tray of glasses, Luis didn't scold him. He handed him a broom and said, "Happened to me my first week. Let's clean it together." Tina had changed too. She still pushed desserts. Old habits die hard. But now she did it with a smile that reached her eyes, and only after making sure her guests were truly satisfied. She'd started remembering regulars' orders. She even kept a small stash of extra napkins and straws for kids who always seemed to need them. One day, she saw the young mother who'd left in tears weeks earlier and quietly brought her family a free dessert. "On me," she'd said. "Welcome back." The CEO didn't stay away. He visited often, never as the boss, but as a guest who cared. Sometimes he sat at the empty seat table himself, just to listen. He heard stories of job losses, of loneliness, of small victories. A first paycheck, a doctor's good news, a grandchild's first steps. He realized his restaurants weren't just places to eat. They were accidental community centers, shelters of normalcy in a world that often felt chaotic. One crisp autumn morning, he returned to the buffet not to inspect, but to share a meal. He'd called ahead and asked Luis to save a table, just an ordinary one near the middle of the room. When he arrived, he wasn't alone. Sitting across from him were the retired teacher and Luis. It was the first time the three of them had eaten together openly, without roles or disguises. They didn't talk about policies or profits. They talked about the changing leaves, about a stray cat that had started hanging around the back alley, about how the chicken pot pie recipe had improved since they started using fresh thyme. The conversation flowed easily, like old friends catching up. At one point, the retired teacher looked at the CEO and said, "You know, I used to think places like this were just for people who could afford to linger. But now it feels like home." The CEO's throat tightened. "That's all I ever wanted it to be." After lunch, as they walked out together, the older man paused at the door. "Thank you," he said simply. "Not just for the meal. For remembering that people like me still matter." The CEO nodded. "You always mattered. I just forgot to look." Back at headquarters, the ripple effects were growing. Other locations had adopted the empty seat program, each in their own way. One in a college town started offering free coffee and study space to students during finals. Another near a hospital began reserving seats for nurses on break, serving them hot meals at odd hours. A manager in a rural town even started delivering leftovers to a nearby shelter, something that would have been unthinkable under the old waste reduction rules. Internally, morale had shifted. Staff surveys showed something new. People didn't just feel satisfied with their jobs, they felt proud. One dishwasher wrote in a feedback form, "For the first time, I feel like my work means something." The CEO knew the road ahead wouldn't be perfect. There would still be bad days, rushed shifts, moments when old habits crept back in. But the compass had been reset. The company wasn't chasing efficiency at the cost of humanity anymore. It was chasing something harder to measure but far more valuable: trust. One evening, months later, the CEO found himself at a different location, this one in a quiet neighborhood he'd never visited before. He sat alone at a corner table, watching the rhythm of the place. A young couple shared a plate of lasagna with their toddler, laughing as the child smeared sauce on her cheeks. An older woman read a book while sipping tea. Two construction workers in dusty boots joked over plates piled high. Then he saw it. A server, A woman he didn't recognize walked past a table where a man sat alone, eating slowly. She paused, then turned back. Without fanfare, she placed an extra slice of garlic bread on his plate. "Just in case," she said with a smile. The man looked up, surprised, then nodded gratefully. The CEO watched, his coffee cooling in his hands. No one had told that server to do that. No policy required it. She'd simply seen someone who might need a little more, and she gave it freely. In that moment, he knew the change had taken root. It wasn't about him anymore. It wasn't about programs or announcements. It was about people choosing, again and again, to treat each other like human beings. He thought back to his father's old diner, the smell of coffee, the sound of the bell above the door, the way his dad would slide an extra pancake onto a trucker's plate without saying a word. He'd spent years building something bigger, faster, shinier. But what he'd really needed to do was come back to that simple truth. Food is love made visible. As he left the restaurant that night, he passed the empty seat table. It was occupied by a young woman with tired eyes and a backpack too big for her frame. A server was refilling her water, chatting softly. The woman smiled, a real one, not forced. The CEO walked out into the cool night air, hands in his pockets. He didn't feel like a CEO just then. He felt like a man who'd finally remembered what mattered. He drove home slowly, windows down, letting the city sounds wash over him. He didn't check his phone. He didn't think about tomorrow's meetings. He just breathed, because for the first time in a long time, he wasn't managing a business. He was part of a community, and that was enough. In the weeks that followed, he made a quiet decision. He'd step back from day-to-day operations, not to disappear, but to listen more. He started visiting locations not as an inspector, but as a guest. He ate at the empty seat table often, not to monitor, but to connect. He kept a small notebook in his coat pocket, jotting down moments of kindness he witnessed. Server covered a guest's tab when their card was declined. Cook made a special plate for a child with allergies, no extra charge. Dishwasher helped an elderly man carry his groceries to the bus stop. These weren't metrics. They were memories. And they were worth more than any quarterly report. One afternoon, he received a letter in the mail. No return address, just a plain envelope. Inside was a handwritten note on lined paper. "I don't know if you'll read this, but I had to say thank you. Last Tuesday, I walked into your buffet feeling like I couldn't go on. I hadn't eaten in 2 days. I sat at that special table, ashamed to be there. But your staff treated me like I was someone's brother, someone's friend. They gave me food, yes, but they gave me hope. I'm getting help now. I'm going to be okay. You gave me a reason to believe that." The CEO read it 3 times. Then he folded it carefully and placed it in his desk drawer, the same one where he kept his father's old apron. He didn't share the letter with anyone. It wasn't his to tell, but it stayed with him, a quiet reminder that the smallest acts can change the course of a life. Years later, when people asked what turned the company around, he never talked about profits or policies. He'd just smile and say, "We remembered that behind every tray there's a person, and people deserve to be treated like they matter." And in the end, that was the whole story. Not of a CEO going undercover, but of a man coming back to himself, and in doing so, helping others feel seen. The buffet lights still shine every evening, warm and steady. The empty seat is always ready, and somewhere a server is offering extra bread just in case.